When filing a bid protest with the GAO, challenging the agency's evaluations of proposals and source selection decision, the standard of award is whether the evaluation and selection decisions were reasonable and consistent with the terms and conditions of the solicitation. Hi everyone, this is Frank with today's bid protest tips. This case comes to us from the GAO, and it involves a request for task order proposals issued by the Department of the Army for biometrics and identity, intelligence, and analytical support services. One thing that's important to note here is there's always an issue with the GAO you got to look at as far as jurisdiction is concerned as it relates to task orders. In this particular case, the GAO did find jurisdiction because the task order at issue is valued in excess of $25 million. Now, this is a great case, in my opinion. This is a great opinion written by the GAO. Unfortunately, the protester lost. However, this decision itself kind of runs through a lot of very important issues in the bid protest arena, and we're going to go ahead and run through a couple of those. First of all, this was a technical evaluation case, and what I like about this decision is it really gets into quite a few details, which is nice for potential protesters to look at, get a rough idea of how the GAO sort of handles these types of issues. From the technical evaluation standpoint, it discussed staffing, acquiring and retaining qualified personnel. It talks about transition plans, and it also talks about cost realism analysis, which is always a little bit of a fuzzy area that is sometimes easy to get a little bit confused about. So, getting back to the technical evaluation factor, in this case the GAO sort of set the standard, and in general it is the standard of review that you're going to see in front of the GAO for these types of cases. And really the standard of review is that in reviewing protests challenging an agency's evaluation of proposals, the GAO does not reevaluate proposals, and it does not substitute its judgment for that of the agency. Instead, what the GAO does is it examines the record to determine whether the agency's judgment was reasonable and whether the judgment was in accord with the stated evaluation criteria and applicable procurement laws and regulations. So essentially, really the issue of, first of all looking and seeing whether the judgment was reasonable, you could look at that as sort of a factual determination. Based on the facts of this case, was the agency's actions reasonable? Once you get past that, let's say it's determined, because if it's determined from a factual standpoint that the agency's actions were unreasonable, then you've won. Now, if it's determined that the agency's actions were in fact reasonable, you might lose, you might still win, because we've still got to go through the second prong, and that is whether the agency's actions were in accord with the stated evaluation criteria and applicable procurement laws and regulations. So you can sort of look at this as sort of a bifurcation of issues. From a factual standpoint, was it reasonable? If the answer is yes, it was reasonable, then you go on to the legal standpoint, which is, of course, examining, first of all, and the biggest one is really, was the decision consistent with the solicitation? Because when you're trying to argue and you're trying to prove that the agency's actions were unreasonable, the agency is able to defend by simply giving one of maybe many reasonable explanations for why they did what they did. So that's not always necessarily the easiest way to prove your case. Sometimes the better and the easier way to prove your case, if the facts are on your side, is really to look at this second prong, which is let's go ahead and compare what the agency did versus what the solicitation says. If the two match, you're probably going to lose your case. If the two don't match, if the agency did something that's not consistent with the solicitation, number one, you've got good grounds for a protest. Number two, you're able to prove that most often in writing. You're able to show what the agency did based on their own records, and you're able to show what the solicitation said based on, again, the agency's own records. So if the facts support that type of an argument, in general, that's usually the best way to go in these types of cases. Now, getting on to cost realism analysis. This is something that gets a little bit from a conceptual standpoint, a little bit hard to kind of hold on to sometimes for a lot of people. And part of the reason is it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. I'm going to go ahead and read this to you and explain to you why on the one hand it doesn't make sense and on the other hand it does. When an agency evaluates a proposal for the award of a cost reimbursement contract or order, an offeror's proposed costs are not dispositive. This is because regardless of the cost proposed, the government is bound to pay the contractor its actual and allowable costs. Okay? So, and then the GAO goes on to say, consequently, an agency must perform a cost realism analysis to determine the extent to which an offeror's proposed costs are realistic for the work to be performed. Now, on the one hand, you can say that doesn't make very much sense, because if the contractor goes ahead and submits proposed costs, they're not going to get paid those costs. They're going to get paid the actual cost pursuant to the terms and conditions of the solicitation, which eventually becomes the contract. So the question becomes, well, if they're going to get paid their actual costs plus profit, then why give proposed costs to begin with? It doesn't seem to make sense. And when looking at it that way, it doesn't make sense, but when looking at it another way, it does. And the reason why is because this is an indication, when a bidder goes ahead and submits costs on a proposal like this, although the government is not bound to pay those costs, it is an indication and can be used as an indication as to whether or not this bidder has a good understanding of the scope of work, has a good understanding of how this contract is going to operate, and it does sort of give a little bit of an indication as to whether or not this contractor may be able to successfully perform the contract or not. Well, why do I say that? Well, because if you have a bidder who comes in and they bid something, let's say it's at 15% of the government's estimate, or let's say they bid something that's 400 times the government's estimate. On the one hand, we know the government is not going to pay the 15% of the estimate, and they're not going to pay the 400 times of the estimate either. We know they're going to be paying actual costs plus overhead and profit. But it's relevant because this indicates potentially when somebody is very high or very low, this indicates that this bidder may not necessarily have a good understanding of this solicitation, may not have understood exactly what they were doing in their proposal, and this now potentially increases the likelihood that they will be unable to successfully perform. So unfortunately in this case, the protester lost. However, I got to tell you, it looks like they fought the good fight. The record just was not on their side in this particular case. Well, I hope this was helpful. I hope you enjoyed. Good luck on that next bid. Thank you.